Can you imagine living next door to a Medal of Honor recipient without even knowing it? Wait until you hear why. If that caught your attention, drop a comment below letting us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more eye-opening stories like this. Hit the bell so you never miss an update. How could you leave the house looking like that, Jack? A veteran should have pride in his appearance. Loud, sharp, and cutting, the words of Dean Ellis echoed across the small cafe, slicing through the quiet morning buzz like a knife. Jack Connolly didn't flinch. He sat still, his hands wrapped around a chipped coffee cup, eyes fixed downward as if the weight of the world were pressing against him. The old coat draped over his thin shoulders, its fabric faded and worn, seemed far too large for the frail man. But what no one in the cafe knew, what Dean certainly had no idea about, was that Jack Connolly carried something far more valuable than pride in his appearance. Hidden under the patchwork fabric of his worn-out coat was one of the rarest and most prestigious military honors, the Medal of Honor. And, as fate would have it, a high-ranking officer was about to reveal it to the whole town. It was a scene that played out too often in the small town of Riversburg, tucked away in the rolling hills of Kentucky. Mornings came slow in these parts. The sun rose behind the jagged mountains, casting soft rays across the dusty streets. The local diner, the Cornerstone Cafe, had been a meeting point for generations of workers, retirees, and veterans, those who had served and those who still carried the weight of old memories. Behind the counter stood Nora, the cafe's owner for nearly 3 decades. A mother to everyone, she knew each regular's order by heart, from the retired coal miners who spent their mornings talking about the old days, to the farmers who still worked the land with their bare hands. But there was one person Nora knew better than anyone else, Jack Connolly. Every morning, Jack arrived at exactly 7:30 a.m., sitting at the same corner table near the window. He ordered the same thing. Black coffee and a single slice of whole wheat toast with homemade peach jam. No frills, no fuss. Jack's daily ritual was simple. He brought with him 3 things, a folded newspaper, a worn pocket watch that belonged to his father, a fellow war hero, and the quiet dignity of someone who had lived through battles, both on and off the field. His military jacket, though faded and worn with time, still held traces of its past grandeur. Few ever noticed the small emblem stitched on the left side of his coat, barely visible due to the years of washing and fading. Only those with sharp eyes could make it out, but no one in the cafe ever dared ask Jack about his past. And Jack, in turn, never offered any explanation. The other veterans who frequented the cafe always greeted him with a subtle nod of respect, but Jack never bragged about his service. He didn't tell war stories, unlike the others who filled the air with tales of bravery and valor. Jack was different, quiet, reserved, and dignified in a way that spoke louder than any words could. The younger generation of veterans barely understood it. They were quick to boast about their own service, as if every achievement was worthy of a medal. But Jack knew better. Some battles, some victories, were too great to be displayed. That day, however, was different. As Dean Ellis, a loudmouthed former Army officer, continued to sneer at Jack's tattered coat, something inside Jack shifted. Dean had always made his presence known, boasting about his military service and mocking those he deemed unworthy. His words stung, but Jack remained quiet, knowing that his story, his true story, was far too important to be overshadowed by someone like Dean. What Dean didn't realize was that beneath Jack's unassuming exterior was a past filled with valor and sacrifice. Dean's words rang through the cafe once more, a real veteran would take pride in himself. Jack's hands, though shaking slightly, never dropped the coffee cup. His gaze never lifted from the table. But when Dean's cruel voice grew louder, something within Jack stirred. The harsh words of Dean Ellis still echoed in the air long after Jack Connolly had left the Cornerstone Cafe. The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable, and for those who had witnessed the confrontation, it was almost unbearable. Dean stood there, a satisfied smirk on his face, waiting for a reaction from the other patrons, but no one spoke. The men in the cafe who had once been Jack's comrades in arms shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what to say, but unwilling to openly challenge Dean. The silence wasn't lost on Nora. She had seen Jack every morning for years. She knew him like she knew the creases in her own apron. He was always quiet, always reserved. Jack wasn't a man who sought attention or accolades. He didn't need praise or public recognition. His sense of honor was rooted deep within, far beyond the reach of the world's superficial gestures. Nora could see it in the way he carried himself, calm, steady, almost too humble for his own good. Jack had always arrived at 7:30 a.m. sharp, his coat heavy on his shoulders despite the summer heat. Over the years, his coat had worn thin, its fabric faded by time, just like the memories it represented. But for Jack, the past was a weight that only he bore. And although he never spoke about it, his eyes often betrayed a depth that others couldn't fathom. For him, every morning was a quiet tribute to those who couldn't return, to the battles that had scarred his body and soul. And yet, despite the medals he had earned, despite the things he had seen and done, he kept it all locked away. What good was recognition when you had already given everything? But today was different. Today, Dean had pushed too far. His careless words stirred something within Jack, something that had long been buried beneath layers of self-restraint and quiet dignity. Dean's mocking had rattled him more than Jack cared to admit, and it wasn't just about the coat. It wasn't even about the disrespectful jabs at Jack's appearance. No, it was the presumption, the belief that Dean could measure the worth of a man based on the outward, superficial things, the clothes he wore, the way he carried himself. Jack knew better than anyone that valor wasn't measured by appearance. Courage wasn't something you wore on your sleeve, and it certainly wasn't something you could flaunt. It was an internal force, a quiet strength that kept you going even when the world around you didn't understand. That's what Dean couldn't grasp. That's what Jack had spent years learning, the difference between the display of bravery and the true meaning of it. As Jack made his way home that morning, he felt the weight of his old military coat pressing down on him. His knees ached with every step, and his hands trembled slightly, but his mind was still sharp. The thoughts that had been gnawing at him for so long bubbled to the surface, demanding attention. He didn't want to think about the war. He didn't want to relive the nightmares that had followed him through every corner of his life. But the memories had a way of surfacing when you least expected it. Jack passed by the town square, a quiet, serene place that had always felt like home. The Brooksville Veterans Memorial stood tall and proud at the center, a tribute to the men and women who had served their country, some of whom had never come home. He had been here many times before, sitting in the shadows, watching as the town gathered for ceremonies and celebrations. Jack always sat quietly in the back, far from the spotlight. He wasn't one for attention. But today, something felt different. The words Dean had thrown at him still lingered, twisting in his gut. He had never sought glory, never looked for recognition. Yet, in the face of Dean's arrogance, something stirred inside Jack. His mind wandered back to a time long ago, to a place where he had stood tall and fearless. There had been a time when Jack had worn his uniform proudly, when the world had recognized him for the hero he was. But those days were long gone. He reached the memorial and stood there for a moment, staring at the names etched in bronze, remembering the faces of men who had never returned home. They were his brothers, his comrades in arms, and their memories were a part of him. Jack placed a hand on the cold stone inside. There was no turning back now. The revelation it was the following Saturday that things began to shift. Jack had made his regular trip to the memorial, as he always did, to clean and maintain the photographs and plaques that honored the fallen soldiers. As he worked, his mind wandered back to the confrontation with Dean. He hadn't expected to be honored. He never had. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Dean had no idea what it meant to sacrifice. Dean had spent his career behind a desk, far from the front lines, talking about logistics and supply chains, while men like Jack had fought to keep the country safe. As Jack stood in front of a photograph of a young soldier who had died in combat, the sound of footsteps approaching interrupted his thoughts. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. He could tell by the weight of the footsteps, the careful precision of each stride. It was General Robert Clark, a man whose name Jack recognized immediately. General Clark had served alongside some of the bravest men Jack had ever known, and in his eyes, Jack saw something rare: respect. Unlike Dean, who had arrogantly flaunted his past, General Clark's presence was commanding, yet humble. The general paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the memorial before landing on Jack. There was no mistake in Clark's gaze, he knew exactly who Jack was. Clark had seen the patch on Jack's coat before. It was a symbol of the Medal of Honor, a decoration awarded only to those who had shown extraordinary courage, far beyond the call of duty. The patch was almost invisible now, faded with time, but General Clark recognized it immediately. Without a word, the general walked toward Jack, stopping just a few feet away. Jack looked up, surprised. But the general didn't speak right away. Instead, he took a moment to study the old man before him, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "Mr. Connolly," General Clark said quietly, his voice calm and steady. "I have to ask, with your permission, where did you serve?" Jack didn't respond immediately. He had lived in this town for years, and for all that time, no one had ever asked him about his service, not directly. Most people knew he was a veteran, but the details were a mystery. Now, here was a man who had seen the same things Jack had, a man who understood the unspoken bond between soldiers. With a deep breath, Jack finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "Vietnam. I served there during the war. But there's no need to talk about that now." General Clark didn't look away. "I understand," he said. "But I can tell you this, Mr. Connolly. Your service has not gone unnoticed." Jack shook his head, a faint smile crossing his lips. "There's no need for recognition. What I did for my brothers. Not for medals or applause." The general stepped closer, his voice carrying a weight that Jack had longed to hear for years. "You served with distinction, Mr. Connolly. And I think it's time the people of this town knew exactly what kind of man they have among them." The silent legacy. The next morning, the town square was filled with flags and decorations in preparation for the Veterans' Day ceremony. The weather had turned cold, but there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. As the crowd began to gather, General Clark took the stage, his uniform pressed and sharp, his presence commanding. After the usual speeches and songs, General Clark stepped forward, holding a small, carefully folded piece of fabric in his hands. He looked out over the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces before him. And then, his gaze landed on Jack, who was seated in the back row, as he always was. The general's voice echoed across the square as he began to speak, his words carrying the weight of history. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we honor a man who served this country with extraordinary valor. A man who wore his uniform with pride, not for recognition, but for the men who couldn't return home. Today, we recognize Jack Connolly, a recipient of the Medal of Honor, for his bravery and sacrifice during the Vietnam War." The crowd was silent at first, unsure of what was happening. But then, as the general's words settled in, something shifted. People began to stand, one by one, as the truth of Jack's service finally came to light. Dean Ellis, standing at the front, froze in disbelief. His jaw hung open as the realization dawned on him. The man he had mocked for so long, Jack Connolly, was not just any veteran. He was a hero. Jack, who had always avoided the spotlight, remained seated. His face was stoic, his eyes scanning the crowd as if this moment were happening in someone else's life. But inside, his heart swelled with a quiet pride not for the recognition, but for the respect that had finally been earned. And for the first time in years, Jack Connolly felt that the weight of his past, of the lives he had saved, of the battles he had fought, was no longer buried in silence. It had finally been acknowledged. The town square was filled with hushed murmurs, and for the first time, the sound of footsteps didn't seem to echo quite as loudly. The flags fluttered in the autumn breeze, and the crowd had gathered in anticipation of the day's ceremony. As General Clark stepped down from the podium, he made his way toward Jack, who still sat in the back, alone in his quiet dignity. The crowd, now on edge from the general's words, watched the two men, unsure of what would happen next. The general, now standing directly before Jack, extended his hand. "Mr. Connolly, I think it's time we recognize you properly," he said. Jack blinked in surprise but stood slowly, accepting the general's handshake with a quiet nod. It was a moment that would change the town forever, one that no one could have predicted. The crowd began to stir, people rising to their feet one by one. Some had been too shocked by the revelation to react immediately. Others stood out of respect. In that moment, a sense of humility flooded over the square, a feeling that was far too rare in a place where pride and pretense often dominated. Jack, ever the humble soul, offered only a faint smile. "There's no need for this, General," he said softly. "I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because it was what needed to be done." General Clark, however, wasn't ready to let this moment slip by unnoticed. "It doesn't matter why you did it, Jack," he replied, his voice steady and clear. "The truth is, what you did, what you've done for this community, for your brothers in arms, and for the memory of the fallen, deserves recognition. You've spent a lifetime giving to others, and now it's time for them to know the man behind the quiet dignity." The crowd, which had been silent just moments ago, now burst into applause. Slowly, at first, hesitant murmurs becoming stronger, louder, until the sound of clapping and cheers filled the square. Everyone had been taken aback by the revelation of Jack's Medal of Honor, but now they understood. The man they had known for so long wasn't just a quiet, humble figure. He was a hero. And the weight of his sacrifice, which he had carried for decades in silence, was finally being acknowledged by the very people who had shared his life. The awakening of Dean Ellis, who had spent years walking the streets of Brooksville with the arrogance of a man who thought his military service entitled him to respect, stood frozen in place. The reality of the situation was dawning on him slowly, painfully. The man he had mocked, Jack Connolly, was the very definition of honor. And here he stood, surrounded by the people of the town, receiving the recognition he had always avoided, yet deserved more than anyone else. Dean's hands clenched at his sides, a cocktail of shame and frustration welling up inside him. He had been so quick to judge, to belittle a man whose service far outweighed his own. And now, in front of everyone, he realized just how wrong he had been. It wasn't just that Jack had been a war hero. It was that Jack had done something far more meaningful. He had lived his life in service to others, not seeking accolades or glory but making sure the legacy of the fallen was preserved. He had served his community, quietly and without fanfare. And Dean had spent years humiliating him for wearing a worn-out coat. The weight of that realization settled on Dean's shoulders like a boulder, suffocating him. Unable to stomach it any longer, Dean took a step backward, as if trying to retreat from the truth. He hadn't just belittled Jack for his appearance. He had mocked the very essence of what it meant to serve, to give without expecting anything in return. As the ceremony continued, Dean found himself retreating into the background, feeling smaller and smaller with each passing moment. He could see the way the townspeople now looked at him, some with curiosity, others with judgment. They had seen his pride, his pretense, and now they saw the depth of Jack's humility. And in that moment, Dean realized that all the titles, all the medals, and all the accomplishments in the world couldn't compare to the quiet strength of a man like Jack Connolly. The community's shift as the applause died down and the ceremony continued, the shift in the town was palpable. People who had always taken Jack's quiet presence for granted now looked at him with newfound respect. Those who had once viewed him as just another old man from the neighborhood now saw him as the pillar of their community, a man who had quietly done more than most ever would in their lifetimes. Nora, who had known Jack for years, felt a swell of pride in her chest as she watched the crowd. She had always known Jack was special. She had seen the way he carried himself, the way he treated others with kindness and respect. But even she had never known the extent of his sacrifice, the weight he carried in silence. Now, as the town's attention turned to him, Nora couldn't help but feel that this was the moment that would define Jack's legacy, both for the community and for himself. Sarah Mitchell, the retired nurse who had always saved the local newspaper for Jack, looked at him with a deep sense of admiration. She remembered how he had saved her grandson, Tommy, from drowning in the river a few years ago, jumping into freezing waters without hesitation. It was the same courage, the same selflessness that had led him to receive the Medal of Honor. But where other men would have boasted about such feats, Jack had kept them to himself, quietly moving through life with a humility that few could understand. The veterans who had shared the cafe with Jack, the men who had fought beside him in their own wars, stood in respectful silence. They understood, perhaps better than anyone else, what it meant to serve without seeking recognition. They knew that Jack's strength wasn't in the medals he wore but in the quiet way he carried the memories of the men who hadn't returned. Tyler's moment of reflection as the ceremony drew to a close, Tyler Madsen couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. He had watched the respect the crowd had shown Jack, the way everyone had finally understood the true depth of his character. It had been hard to ignore though. As the ceremony drew to a close, Tyler Madsen couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. He had watched the respect the crowd had shown Jack, the way everyone had finally understood the true depth of his character. It had been hard to ignore the realization that he had spent so much of his time looking down on someone whose character far surpassed his own. Tyler walked back to the Cornerstone Cafe that afternoon, determined to make things right. He had no idea how to apologize, how to fix the damage he had done, but he knew he couldn't leave things the way they were. He had spent so long hiding behind his rank, behind his shiny medals and stories of logistical feats, and now he realized that none of that mattered in the face of true heroism. When Tyler entered the cafe, he saw Jack sitting at his usual spot by the window. The other patrons, now more respectful than ever, nodded quietly in Jack's direction. Tyler walked up to the counter, ordered his coffee, and sat down a few tables away, watching Jack from across the room. There were so many things Tyler wanted to say, but for the first time, words felt insufficient. As Jack glanced up from his newspaper, his eyes met Tyler's. Tyler saw something in those eyes, an understanding, a forgiveness, perhaps even a recognition that Jack knew what had happened. But there was no anger in his gaze, no resentment. Jack had always been a man of grace. Tyler stood up slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. With a deep breath, he walked over to Jack's table and stood there for a moment before speaking. "I owe you an apology," Tyler said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "For everything I said. For everything I did." Jack looked up at him, his expression calm but knowing. "There's no need for that, son," he replied, his voice quiet and measured. "What matters is that you've learned. Some lessons are hard-earned, but they stick with you." Tyler nodded, feeling the weight of those words. "Can I help you with anything today?" he asked, the humility in his voice genuine now. Jack smiled, a faint glint of amusement in his eyes. "You can start by passing me that cloth," he said, gesturing to the rag Jack used to wipe down the table. "Then we can clean this place together." And so, the two men worked side by side, each learning something new about the other. Tyler, once a man defined by arrogance and pride, found humility in the simplest of actions. And Jack, the man who had silently carried the burden of his past, realized that sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on the battlefield, but in the quiet moments of understanding and forgiveness. The next few weeks in Riversburg passed by at a slower pace than usual. The season was turning, the leaves of the oak trees in the town square slowly changing color as fall settled in. But for the people of Riversburg, life felt different now. The events of Veterans Day had altered the town's rhythm. The revelation about Jack Connolly had not only shifted how the community viewed him, but it had also left an indelible mark on the hearts of those who had witnessed the truth unfold. Tyler Madsen, for one, was a changed man. He had always considered himself a man of honor, someone who understood discipline and the value of hard work. But now, after being forced to confront his own arrogance and pride, Tyler had started to understand something far deeper, something that couldn't be taught in a military academy or learned in the confines of a strict uniform code. He had started to learn about true humility. It wasn't something that could be bought with medals or earned with boastful stories. It was something that Jack Connolly had embodied without saying a word. Tyler had spent many sleepless nights reflecting on the way he had treated Jack. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of the older man sitting quietly at the cafe with his worn-out coat would flash before him, and he couldn't shake the feeling of regret. Jack had carried with him the weight of battles fought and lives lost. Yet, he had never once asked for recognition. He had only wanted to quietly honor those who couldn't be there to tell their stories. Tyler's first step toward change came quietly, in the early hours of a chilly morning, when he decided to visit Jack's house. He had been sitting with his coffee at the Cornerstone Cafe when he realized that his apology had only been the beginning. Jack had shown him a path that he needed to walk if he ever hoped to be a better man. Tyler had heard whispers from some of the locals about Jack's life, about the way he had kept the memorial clean, fixed broken plaques with his own hands, and spent money from his retirement just to maintain the small, unassuming tribute to the fallen. Tyler knew what he had to do. The visit to Jack's house. Tyler knocked on the door of Jack Connolly's small, unassuming house with a sense of trepidation. The house was simple, nestled in a quiet corner of Riversburg, much like Jack himself. No grandiosity, no ostentation. Just a small white house, the kind of home that fit in seamlessly with the town. It was nothing like the homes Tyler was used to, homes filled with polished furniture and the best of everything. Jack's house was a reflection of who he was, a man who didn't need more than what he had, a man who gave freely without expecting anything in return. Tyler had not expected Jack to answer the door immediately. Jack, after all, was a man of routine. He would be at the memorial, like he always was on Saturday mornings. But when Tyler knocked, there was no hesitation. Jack opened the door slowly, his tired eyes locking onto Tyler's with a hint of recognition. Tyler could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his palms slightly sweaty. He had come to apologize, but deep down, he knew an apology wasn't enough. The damage he had done wasn't something that could simply be erased with words. Mr. Connolly, Tyler began, his voice faltering slightly, I came to speak with you. To make things right. Jack studied him for a moment, his expression neutral but not unfriendly. Come in, Tyler, Jack said, his voice soft. He stepped aside to let Tyler into the small, tidy home. The living room was sparsely furnished but warm, with a few framed photographs on the walls. Jack led him into the kitchen and gestured for him to sit at the small table by the window. Tyler took a seat, but his eyes wandered around the room, taking in the simple, unpretentious surroundings. There were no signs of wealth here, no signs of any desire for recognition. Everything about Jack's home, just like his character, was grounded in modesty. I owe you an apology, Mr. Connolly, Tyler began again, this time with more sincerity. For everything I said. For everything I did. I've spent too much time thinking that my own service, my own accomplishments, made me better than others. But the truth is, I've been blind. I've been arrogant. And I treated you with disrespect. You didn't deserve that. Jack's face softened slightly, and he nodded slowly. Tyler, there's no need for that. I've lived with a lot of things in silence, things that I didn't need others to understand. I never needed anyone to apologize for the way they treated me. But I want to, Tyler said, his voice growing more earnest. I want to do something that shows you I understand. That I've learned. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I want to help. Help you with the memorial, with the upkeep. I want to contribute, not just as a token of apology, but because I see now that what you do, it's important. More important than anything I've ever done. Jack regarded him silently for a moment, his eyes reflecting the weight of everything he had seen and experienced. He had never asked for help, never expected anything from anyone. But in that moment, he saw something in Tyler, something he hadn't seen before. He saw someone who was willing to change, someone who was willing to step out of his own pride and make things right. You don't have to help, Tyler, Jack said gently. But if you want to, you're welcome to. We can do this together. The memorial is for all of us. It's not just about me. It's about remembering those who aren't here anymore. Tyler's heart swelled with both gratitude and guilt. Thank you, Jack. I won't let you down. The work at the memorial. Tyler's first Saturday at the memorial was humbling. He arrived at the site early, just as Jack was beginning his usual routine of cleaning the photographs and maintaining the plaques. The air was crisp, and the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves of the oak trees gave the memorial a somber, almost sacred atmosphere. Tyler had visited the memorial many times before, but never had it felt so meaningful, so powerful. As Jack worked, Tyler stood nearby, unsure of where to start. But Jack simply handed him a cloth and gestured to the photo of a young soldier. Start with this one, Jack said quietly. He was a good man. Saved a lot of lives. Tyler nodded and stepped forward. The photograph was old, the edges curling from age. It showed a young soldier with a bright smile, his eyes full of hope. Tyler ran the cloth gently over the glass, his mind wandering back to the past. He couldn't help but think about his own time in the military, the comfort he had found in his desk job far from the front lines. He had always assumed that those who fought were the ones who mattered most, the ones whose stories deserved to be told. But now, as he stood beside Jack, cleaning the photographs of those who had fought and died, Tyler realized how wrong he had been. Thank you, Tyler said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I understand now. This isn't about medals or recognition. It's about honoring those who gave everything. Jack nodded, his expression unreadable. It's about remembering them. That's all. For the rest of the morning, Tyler and Jack worked side by side, maintaining the memorial, cleaning the photos, and replacing the flowers in the vases. It wasn't much, but it felt like the most important work Tyler had ever done. And as they worked together, Tyler understood that true honor came not from accolades, but from the quiet acts of remembrance, of respect, and of service to others. The autumn air in Riversburg seemed to hold a different weight now, one that was more contemplative, more introspective. The town, once known for its quiet simplicity, had begun to shift in ways that no one could have anticipated. The reverence for Jack Connolly had spread far beyond the ceremony. It had become a living, breathing part of the town's heartbeat. Tyler Madsen had changed too. The man who had once been the loudest voice in the room, the one who had proudly worn his service like a badge of superiority, was now quieter, more humble. His daily walks to the Cornerstone Cafe became moments of reflection, not just for himself, but for the people around him. The relationships he had once overlooked, the simple gestures of kindness from locals, began to stand out in ways they never had before. Every morning, Tyler now made a point to sit at the table nearest to Jack's, waiting for the older man to come in. There was no agenda, no rush, just a subtle bond forming over the shared silence and mutual respect. But Jack, as always, maintained his quiet dignity. He would come in, order his coffee, and settle in at the corner, just as he had always done. His life had not changed in the dramatic way Tyler's had, but it was clear that the town had begun to see him differently. People who once overlooked him now offered respectful nods when they entered the cafe. The veterans who had shared their war stories at the table across the room no longer patted Jack on the back and walked away, instead, they stayed and listened, really listened, to his quiet wisdom. One particularly crisp Saturday morning, after they had spent the usual hours maintaining the memorial, Jack turned to Tyler. You know, Jack said, his voice quiet but firm, there's no need to keep apologizing. You've done more than enough. Tyler glanced at Jack, the weight of the past few weeks settling over him. I don't think I can ever truly make up for the way I treated you, Jack. But I've come to realize something. He paused, taking a breath, trying to find the right words. I thought I understood service. But I didn't. Not like you do. Jack gave a small nod, his eyes focused on the rows of plaques that they had just cleaned. He didn't need to say anything. His presence spoke volumes. There was a quiet understanding between them, a bond built on more than just words. It was built on respect, on the hard-won lessons of life and war that neither of them would ever be able to fully explain to anyone else. The town begins to change. The true change in Riversburg came slowly, like a flower that blooms in its own time. At first, it was small things. Neighbors started offering Jack rides to and from the memorial, even though he had always walked there. People who used to walk past the memorial without a second thought now stopped to look at the names on the walls, to read the stories of the men and women who had given everything. The town began to understand the meaning of sacrifice, not just on a grand scale, but on a personal level. Jack had never asked for any of this. His dignity, his quiet service to his brothers in arms, had always been enough for him. But now, the people of Riversburg were beginning to see the true cost of freedom, the true weight of honor. They were learning from Jack, not through grand speeches or public displays, but through his actions. His example, quietly and steadfastly lived, was having a deeper impact on the community than any of them could have predicted. Even the cafe had changed. Dolores, who had worked at the Cornerstone for years, couldn't help but notice how the energy in the room had shifted. There were no more awkward silences when Jack entered. People didn't glance around nervously as they once had, unsure of how to greet the quiet veteran in the worn coat. Now, they made sure Jack's coffee was just right, even before he asked. They made sure he had a seat, that he felt comfortable, because they understood the value of what he had given. And in a small town like Riversburg, that recognition meant everything. Tyler, who had once been the loudest voice in the cafe, now sat quietly, observing the change with a new sense of humility. He had learned something that no one could have taught him, respect for those who serve, not for what they wear or how they look, but for the sacrifices they've made. The soldiers who returned home, like Jack, had come back to a world that didn't always understand them, didn't always appreciate the cost of what they had given. But Riversburg was different now. They were beginning to understand. A transformative moment for Tyler. The turning point came one winter morning when Tyler found himself once again sitting at his usual table at the Cornerstone. Jack had arrived as usual, his old coat hanging loosely on his shoulders. But this time, Tyler had something different in mind. He stood up as Jack entered, a gesture that felt foreign at first, but it came naturally now. He didn't wait for Jack to sit down or give any kind of acknowledgement. Tyler simply walked over and stood beside the table. Jack, I want to do something for you, Tyler said, his voice steady, the tone carrying a new sense of purpose. Jack looked up at him, a small, bemused smile tugging at his lips. What do you mean? I've been thinking about it, and I want to do something that's worthy of your service. You've given more to this town than anyone could ever realize. I've set up a fund, with the help of some of the veterans here. We want to restore the memorial, make it a place that's worthy of those we've lost. But it's not just about the memorial. We want to build a scholarship for veterans who want to go back to school, a way to give back to those who are still fighting their battles after they come home. Jack raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the offer. He wasn't a man who sought recognition, and this wasn't something he'd ever asked for. But Tyler's sincerity was evident. You don't need to do this, Jack said quietly. The memorial is fine the way it is. The real tribute is in remembering the men who never came back. Tyler shook his head. This isn't for you, Jack. It's for everyone who's served, for the men and women who have gone unnoticed for too long. And it's because of you that we're finally starting to understand the real cost of what service means. Jack was silent for a long moment, staring at Tyler with an intensity that spoke volumes. And then, without a word, he reached out and shook Tyler's hand. "Thank you," Jack said, his voice low. "You're doing something important here, son. Something that matters." And with that, the two men stood there, side by side, their silent bond stronger than ever. It was a bond that didn't need words. It was a bond built on respect, on sacrifice, and on the quiet dignity that Jack had shown, not just to his fellow veterans, but to everyone in Riversburg. The days that followed Tyler's proposal to restore the memorial and create a scholarship fund passed with a kind of quiet determination. In the weeks after that conversation with Jack, things began to change in Riversburg, more visibly than ever before. Tyler's idea, once a quiet thought between the two of them, had turned into something real. The community had rallied behind it, far more than Tyler had ever expected. It began with the veterans. The men who had once shared drinks at the cafe, telling exaggerated tales of their younger days, now took on a different role in the town. They weren't just former soldiers, they were mentors, guides, and living reminders of the sacrifices made. Word spread quickly through the town, and those who had not yet fully understood the gravity of Jack's service were now beginning to see it in a new light. Tyler, for his part, had fully embraced his role as the organizer. Gone was the arrogance that once defined him. He threw himself into the project, often meeting with local business owners, soldiers, and community leaders to make sure the scholarship fund and memorial restoration gained momentum. It wasn't about recognition anymore. It was about making sure that the sacrifices made by men like Jack would never be forgotten, not just in Riversburg but beyond. The fund takes shape. The idea for the scholarship fund began to gain traction quickly. At first, it was a small effort, a handful of veterans and local citizens contributing what they could to the cause. But as Tyler worked, reaching out to the families of fallen soldiers and the veterans who had returned home, the fund began to grow. Soon, businesses began to offer donations. The mayor, who had always been more reserved about such efforts, gave his approval. The memorial restoration was equally important, and Tyler knew it had to reflect the true gravity of the sacrifices made by the soldiers. The work on the memorial began with the veterans themselves, with the help of local artisans who donated their skills. The brickwork that had faded with the years was carefully repaired. The plaques, which had been worn down by time, were painstakingly cleaned and preserved. It became a labor of love for the entire town, a chance to give back to those who had given everything. Every Saturday, Tyler joined Jack at the memorial. They weren't just there to work, they were there to remember. Each visit was a small act of honoring the fallen soldiers, a way to keep their memories alive in the hearts of those who remained. As Tyler worked side by side with Jack, he learned more than just how to maintain the memorial. He learned the meaning of service, of remembrance, and of honoring the past with humility. One day, as the work continued, Tyler approached Jack, his heart full. "I don't think I ever understood what you meant by honoring the past before," Tyler said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "But now, I see it. It's about the small things, the quiet acts of respect. Not the speeches. Not the medals. But the way you remember the ones who didn't come back." Jack, who had been stoically working with his hands, looked up at him. For a moment, the weight of his own memories seemed to wash over him. "It's about the quiet moments," Jack said, his voice low but steady. "The things no one else sees. They're the ones that count the most." Tyler nodded in agreement. In those words, he found the last pieces of the puzzle. Jack wasn't just honoring the past with these small acts of remembrance, he was teaching Tyler how to live with integrity, how to carry that quiet dignity with him in everything he did. The scholarship fund's first award months passed, and the scholarship fund began to take shape. Tyler watched as the first round of applicants came in, young veterans who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, many of whom had struggled to transition back into civilian life. The scholarships weren't just about funding education, they were a way to help these young men and women rebuild their lives, to honor their service, and to give them a chance to find a new path. The first recipient was a young man named Ryan, an Iraq War veteran who had come back to Riversburg after his discharge. Ryan had spent the last few years trying to find his place, working odd jobs to get by. But like so many soldiers, he struggled with the transition. The scholarship gave him the opportunity to attend college and begin studying for a career in social work. His goal was simple: to help fellow veterans who were struggling with the same things he had faced. At the ceremony where the scholarship was awarded, Tyler stood beside Ryan, Jack watching quietly in the background. Tyler made a short speech, something he had never imagined himself doing in the past, but now it felt right. "I want to thank you, Ryan, for your service. And I want to thank everyone here today for making this possible," Tyler said, his voice full of emotion. "This isn't just about one man. This is about all of us. It's about remembering what these men and women have done for this country, and ensuring that we do everything in our power to make their lives better when they come home." Ryan stood, his face a mix of surprise and gratitude. As he accepted the scholarship, the crowd clapped, but it wasn't just for the money, it was for the fact that they had all come together to honor something bigger than themselves. Jack, standing at the back of the crowd, watched quietly. His expression remained unchanged, but inside, he felt a deep sense of peace. The community that had once been hesitant to acknowledge his past was now fully aware of the sacrifices he had made, and more importantly, they had embraced the idea that his legacy wasn't about the recognition he had earned, but about what he had done for others. Tyler's redemption. As the months went on, Tyler found himself increasingly involved in the town's efforts to remember and honor its fallen soldiers. He wasn't just the organizer of a scholarship fund anymore, he had become a vital part of the community's effort to heal and rebuild. And through this work, Tyler began to understand something deeper about himself: the value of humility, of giving back, and of living a life that was worthy of the sacrifices made by others. Jack, who had always been a man of few words, became Tyler's closest mentor. Through his actions, Jack had shown Tyler what true heroism was. The quiet, often unseen moments where a person chooses to honor their past, their comrades, and their community. Tyler knew that he could never fully repay Jack for the lessons he had learned, but he was determined to continue the work Jack had started. On Veterans Day, the town of Riversburg gathered at the memorial, now fully restored and shining in the autumn sun. Tyler stood beside Jack, looking out over the crowd. There were children running around, veterans chatting quietly, and families honoring the legacy of those who had served. But amidst the crowd, Tyler saw something more important: a sense of unity, of understanding, and of respect for what had been done. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, Tyler turned to Jack, his voice quiet. "Thank you," he said simply. Jack nodded, his gaze soft. "It's not about me, Tyler. It's about all of us. We're all just carrying the weight of the past, one day at a time." And in that moment, Tyler understood. The work, the sacrifice, the memories, they were all part of a larger tapestry. A tapestry that, though it might never be fully understood by everyone, was woven through every act of humility, every moment of respect, and every gesture of remembrance. The story of Jack Connolly and Tyler Madsen offers profound lessons about humility, respect, and the true cost of service. In a world often obsessed with outward appearances, titles, and accolades, Jack's quiet dignity serves as a reminder that true honor is found in actions, not in external recognition. His unwavering dedication to honoring the fallen, maintaining the memorial, and living with integrity teaches us that the most valuable contributions are often the ones made without expectation of reward. Tyler's journey from arrogance to humility underscores the importance of self-reflection and growth. It's easy to be consumed by one's own accomplishments, but true fulfillment comes when we acknowledge our flaws, make amends, and give back to the community. This story reminds us that respect for others, especially those who have served, is not something to be taken lightly. It's built over time through small, consistent acts of kindness, understanding, and gratitude. Whether it's honoring the memories of the fallen or simply taking the time to appreciate those around us, every gesture counts. If you found value in this story and the lessons it offers, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell to stay updated. Your support helps us continue sharing impactful stories like this one.